My name is Sage Whitmore, and I'm 28 years old. For 15 years, I believed my Uncle Harrison was my savior, the man who rescued me from abandonment when my parents disappeared without a trace. I built my entire identity around gratitude for his generosity, working tirelessly to prove myself worthy of his kindness. But last Tuesday, while cleaning out his study after his sudden death, I found a locked drawer containing documents that shattered everything I thought I knew about my family. What I discovered wasn't just betrayal, it was a calculated deception that had stolen my entire inheritance and destroyed lives I never even knew existed. Before we dive into this family revenge story that'll make your blood boil, let me ask, where are you watching from? I'd love to know. And if stories about family karma and long-awaited justice get your heart racing like mine, smash that like button and subscribe, because this tale of sweet revenge is just getting started. Trust me, you won't want to miss how this family betrayal finally gets the justice it deserves. Growing up, I wore my tragic backstory like a badge of honor. My parents abandoned me when I was 13. I'd tell people watching their faces fill with sympathy, but my amazing uncle took me in and gave me everything. It was my origin story, the foundation of who I thought I was, a grateful girl who'd overcome abandonment through the kindness of family. Uncle Harrison lived in a sprawling estate in Connecticut, the kind of old money mansion that screamed generational wealth. Persian rugs covered hardwood floors that creaked with history, and oil paintings of stern-faced ancestors watched from every wall. When he brought me there in 2008, still reeling from what I believed was my parents' sudden departure, the house felt like a museum. Beautiful but cold. "Your parents were always irresponsible," Sage Harrison would say whenever I asked about them. "They left debts, chaos, and you. But family takes care of family." He'd pat my shoulder with his manicured hand, gold rings catching the light from the chandelier. "I'm all you have now, and I'll make sure you're provided for." And provide he did. Private schools, tutoring, designer clothes, summer camps, everything a privileged teenager could want. But it came with expectations. "You need to understand your place," he'd remind me. "Gratitude is earned through excellence." I became obsessed with perfection, terrified that any misstep might result in the same abandonment I'd already endured. The house staff treated me kindly but maintained distance. Mrs. Chen, the housekeeper, would sometimes look at me with something that seemed like pity, but when I asked if she'd known my parents, she'd simply say, "That's not my place to discuss, dear." The gardener, old Thomas, once started to tell me something about your father's garden, but Harrison appeared and curtly dismissed him. High school was a blur of achievements designed to make Harrison proud. Valedictorian debate team captain, early admission to Yale. I collected accolades like armor against the fear of abandonment. My classmates envied my lifestyle, but I envied their easy relationships with parents who stayed. I dated occasionally, but never seriously. How could I trust anyone to stay when my own parents hadn't? Harrison never married, claiming his dedication to raising me prevented romantic entanglements. "You're my legacy now," he'd say, and I'd feel both honored and burdened by that responsibility. He spoke often about the family business, Whitmore Holdings, a real estate empire built by his grandfather. "One day, when you're ready, this will all be yours," he promised. College at Yale was my first taste of independence, but even there, Harrison's influence followed. He'd call weekly, asking about grades, friendships, future plans. "Remember, you represent the family name," he'd remind me. I studied business and finance, preparing to inherit the empire he dangled before me like a carrot. After graduation, I moved back to the estate to work alongside Harrison. The business was thriving. Luxury developments, commercial properties, investment portfolios worth hundreds of millions. I threw myself into learning every aspect, working 16-hour days to prove my worthiness. Harrison seemed pleased but maintained emotional distance, treating me more like a promising employee than family. The years blended together in a haze of board meetings, property acquisitions, and charity galas where Harrison would introduce me as my dear niece, the future of Whitmore Holdings. I lived in a beautiful cage, grateful for my gilded prison, never questioning why photo albums contained no pictures of my parents, why I had no contact with other relatives, why Harrison deflected every question about my family's past. Looking back, the signs were everywhere. Harrison's refusal to discuss my parents in detail, the way staff members sometimes started sentences about my family then stopped abruptly, the locked rooms in the mansion that I was told contained old business documents, nothing interesting. But I was too grateful, too afraid of losing everything to push for answers that might shatter my carefully constructed world. By my mid-20s, subtle tensions began emerging in my relationship with Harrison. What I'd once seen as protective guidance started feeling more like control. He vetoed my attempts to travel independently, claiming business obligations required my presence. When I expressed interest in learning about our family history for a genealogy project, his reaction was swift and severe. "The past is buried for good reasons, Sage," he snapped, his usually composed demeanor cracking. "Your parents brought nothing but shame to this family. Focus on your future, not their failures." But his eyes betrayed something beyond disappointment. They showed fear. The first major crack appeared during a business dinner with potential investors. Harrison introduced me as usual, but when an older gentleman mentioned knowing Samuel Whitmore's daughter, Harrison's face went pale. "I think you're mistaken," Harrison said quickly, but the man persisted. No, I remember distinctly. Samuel had such plans for that property development before the accident. Such a tragedy leaving behind that young daughter." The man looked at me kindly. "You have his eyes, you know." That night, I confronted Harrison about Samuel Whitmore. "Who is he?" "Another relative you've never mentioned," but Harrison's explanation felt rehearsed hollow. "A distant cousin who died in a car accident years ago." The resemblance is coincidental. Yet, he couldn't meet my eyes when he said it. My investigation began innocently enough. Late-night internet searches for Whitmore family genealogy, visits to public records offices during lunch breaks. What I found were fragments that didn't fit Harrison's narrative. Property deeds showing a Samuel Whitmore who'd owned significant holdings in the 1990 seconds. Newspaper clippings about a successful young businessman with expansion plans cut short by tragedy. Mrs. Chen became my unwitting ally when I caught her going through old photographs in the attic. She startled when she saw me quickly shuffling the pictures back into a box, but not before I glimpsed a photo of a couple who looked remarkably like me standing in front of what appeared to be our estate's garden. "Who are they?" I asked, but Mrs. Chen just shook her head. "Some pictures are better left in boxes, dear. Some stories are too painful to tell." She touched my cheek gently. "But you have every right to know yours when the time comes." The second major crack came during Harrison's hospitalization for pneumonia last winter. While he recovered, I handled business operations and gained access to files I'd never seen before. Buried in routine paperwork, I found references to trust funds, estate transfers, and legal proceedings from the early 2000s. Names I didn't recognize appeared repeatedly: Samuel and Elena Whitmore, represented by attorneys in matters involving custody and estate disputes. When I tried to access these files digitally, I discovered they required passwords I didn't have. Physical copies were locked in Harrison's private office safe, the combination known only to him. But I'd seen enough to know that my family story had chapters Harrison had deliberately hidden from me. His recovery brought renewed vigilance. Harrison seemed to sense my growing curiosity and began restricting my access to certain business areas. "These are sensitive historical matters," he explained. When I asked about the locked files, "Nothing that concerns your future with a company." But I'd tasted knowledge and hunger for truth consumed me. I started documenting everything: conversations that didn't add up, business transactions with questionable dates, Harrison's increasingly nervous behavior when certain topics arose. I created a secret folder on my personal laptop collecting evidence of inconsistencies in the story I'd been told my entire life. The photograph became my obsession. During one of Mrs. Chen's days off, I snuck back to the attic and found the box she'd been examining. Inside were dozens of photos spanning decades, but the couple from the garden appeared in several. They looked happy, successful, surrounded by the same staff members who'd raised me. In one photo, the woman was clearly pregnant, her hand resting protectively on her belly while the man's arm encircled her shoulders. On the back of that photograph in faded ink, someone had written Samuel and Elena expecting baby Sage, 1994. My hands trembled as the implications crashed over me. These weren't distant relatives who'd died tragically. These were my parents, and they'd lived in this house, this estate I'd been told belonged to Harrison's generosity. Harrison's death came suddenly on a Monday morning in March. Mrs. Chen found him in his study slumped over the mahogany desk where he'd conducted business for decades. The doctor said it was a massive heart attack. Quick, painless, final. As I stood in that same study, receiving condolences from business associates and preparing for funeral arrangements, I felt an unexpected emotion alongside my grief relief, that I could finally uncover the truth. The funeral was a grand affair befitting a man of Harrison's standing. Hundreds attended, business partners, politicians, socialites, all paying respects to the real estate magnate who'd built an empire. But as I delivered the eulogy praising the uncle who'd saved me from abandonment, my words felt hollow. Too many questions remained unanswered, too many inconsistencies unexplored. The will reading the following week brought its own shocks. Harrison had left me everything. The mansion, the business investments, worth over $300 million. Your uncle was very clear about his intentions, the attorney explained. He considered you his greatest achievement, the daughter he never had. Yet even in this moment of inheritance, something felt wrong. Why did the attorney keep glancing at sealed documents? Why did some clauses reference previous estate matters without explanation? The morning I discovered the truth started like any other. I was cleaning out Harrison's study, sorting through decades of accumulated papers, when I noticed something odd about his desk. The bottom drawer, which I'd always assumed was decorative, had a small keyhole hidden beneath the brass handles. Among Harrison's personal effects, I found an ornate skeleton key that fit perfectly. Inside that locked drawer lay a manila folder thick with documents that would destroy everything I thought I knew about my life. The first paper was a death certificate dated the 15th of December 2007. Samuel Whitmore, age 31. Cause of death automobile accident. The second was another death certificate, same date. Elena Whitmore, age 29, same cause. My parents hadn't abandoned me. They died when I was 13, leaving me orphaned. But that was just the beginning. Beneath the death certificates were legal documents that painted a horrifying picture. A will naming Samuel as Harrison's brother, not cousin, and designating me as the sole heir to the entire Whitmore estate. Guardianship papers showing Harrison as temporary custodian until I reached majority age. Trust fund documents establishing a fortune in my name managed by Harrison until the beneficiary reaches age 25. I was 28 years old. I should have inherited everything 3 years ago. My hands shook as I read court documents from 2008 detailing custody proceedings. Harrison had petitioned for permanent guardianship, claiming in sworn affidavits that my parents had been financially irresponsible and emotionally unstable. Character witnesses testified to their alleged instability, their poor judgment, their inability to provide for my welfare, but the dates were wrong. The witnesses were Harrison's business associates. The evidence was fabricated. The most damning document was a psychiatric evaluation report I'd supposedly undergone at age 13, declaring me traumatized by parental abandonment and requiring extensive therapeutic intervention. I remembered no such evaluation. According to these papers, I'd been so damaged by my parents' alleged abandonment that I'd blocked out all memories of their death, creating a false narrative of abandonment to cope with the trauma. But I remembered the night they died. I remembered the police officers at our door, their solemn faces as they explained about the car accident. I remembered Harrison arriving hours later, not as a rescuing uncle, but as a man who saw opportunity in tragedy. I remembered him telling me as I sobbed in my room that it would be easier if we told people my parents had left rather than died. Less painful for you, dear. Less complicated for everyone. As I continued reading, the scope of Harrison's deception became clear. He'd systematically stolen my inheritance by convincing a judge that I was psychologically unfit to inherit at 25, extending his control indefinitely. He'd used forged medical documents, fabricated witness testimony, and his own reputation to paint my parents as failures while positioning himself as my savior. The final document in the folder was a letter in Harrison's handwriting dated just 6 months ago. If Sage is reading this, then I am dead and my deception is about to be exposed. I want her to understand that I never intended for it to go this far. When Samuel and Elena died, I saw an opportunity to finally claim what I believed was rightfully mine. Samuel was always father's favorite, always the golden child who would inherit everything. When they died, leaving only a 13-year-old girl between me and the fortune I'd worked my entire life to deserve, I made a choice. I told myself I was protecting her from the trauma of their death. I convinced myself that letting her believe they'd abandoned her was kinder than facing the reality of their loss. But the truth is, I was protecting myself. I wanted the business, the estate, the respect that comes with the Whitmore name. I thought I could control the narrative indefinitely. By the time Sage turned 25, I was too deep in the lie to surface. The business had grown under my management, my reputation was established, and admitting the truth would have destroyed everything I'd built. I kept telling myself I'd find the right moment to confess, but years passed and that moment never came. I know what I've done is unforgivable. I've stolen not just money, but her entire identity, her connection to her parents' memory, her right to grieve them properly. If there's any justice in this world, she'll expose everything and claim what was always hers. As I finished reading, 15 years of carefully constructed reality crumbled around me. I wasn't a grateful orphan saved by a generous uncle. I was a victim of calculated fraud manipulated by a man who'd stolen my parents' legacy and convinced me to be thankful for the crumbs of my own inheritance. The grief, the gratitude, the desperate need to prove myself worthy, all of it had been built on lies. But with truth came something Harrison had never anticipated: fury. And with that fury came a plan for justice that would expose his crimes and restore not just my inheritance, but my parents' stolen reputation. The days following my discovery blurred together in a haze of rage and revelation. I couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, couldn't focus on anything except the magnitude of Harrison's betrayal. But beneath the fury, something else grew: a cold, calculating determination to expose every lie and reclaim not just my inheritance, but the truth about my parents' lives and deaths. My first call was to David Morrison, the family attorney who'd handled Harrison's estate. When I requested a meeting to discuss irregularities in family records, his immediate defensiveness told me everything I needed to know. "I'm not sure what you mean, Miss Whitmore. Your uncle's affairs were always in perfect order." But his voice carried the tremor of a man protecting dangerous secrets. "I found documents suggesting my parents died when I was 13, not abandoned me as I was told," I said, carefully watching his reaction over video call. The color drained from his face so completely that I thought he might faint. "I think there may have been some misunderstanding about inheritance matters." The meeting he scheduled for the following day felt like a chess game where I was finally learning the rules. Morrison's office was as impressive as expected. Floor-to-ceiling law books, mahogany furniture, portraits of distinguished partners. But the man behind the imposing desk looked smaller than I remembered. His confidence evaporated in the face of exposed truth. "Your uncle was very concerned about your psychological well-being," Morrison began his prepared speech, sounding rehearsed. "The decision to simplify the narrative of your parents' passing was made with your best interests in mind. You were quite traumatized, according to the specialists." I placed copies of the documents I'd found on his desk. Specialists who examined me on dates when I was attending school according to my academic records. Witnesses who testified to my parents' instability while they were actually managing a successful business. Medical reports signed by doctors who, according to state licensing boards, didn't exist. Morrison's hands shook as he examined the papers. For several minutes, the only sound was the ticking of an antique clock and the rustle of documents that condemned him as an accomplice to 15 years of fraud. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely a whisper. Harrison told me you'd blocked out the trauma completely. He said the psychologists recommended maintaining the abandonment narrative to prevent psychological breakdown. I trusted his judgment as your guardian. You helped him steal my inheritance, I said flatly. You knew I should have gained control at 25, yet you allowed him to maintain guardianship based on fabricated evidence. That makes you complicit in fraud, conspiracy, and theft of approximately $300 million. The next hour was a masterclass in legal panic. Morrison called in senior partners who called their own specialists who confirmed what I already knew: Harrison's guardianship had been obtained through perjury and fraud. The psychological evaluations were forged, the medical experts were fictitious, and the character witnesses had lied under oath. More importantly, the statute of limitations hadn't expired because the fraud had been ongoing until Harrison's death. But my investigation was just beginning. I hired a private investigator, Rebecca Torres, whose reputation for uncovering financial crimes was legendary. Within a week, she traced the full scope of Harrison's deception. Bank records showed he'd been systematically draining my trust fund to finance his lavish lifestyle and business expansions. Properties bought with my inheritance had been titled in his name. Investments made with my money had generated profits he'd kept entirely for himself. This is one of the most elaborate inheritance frauds I've ever seen, Rebecca reported during our meeting at her downtown office. He didn't just steal your money. He stole your identity, your family history, your right to grieve. And he did it so systematically that you thanked him for it. The emotional toll was devastating. I'd spent 15 years grateful to a man who'd robbed me, working to prove myself worthy of my own inheritance. Every achievement I'd celebrated with Harrison had been paid for with my own stolen money. Every kindness he'd shown was return generosity funded by the fortune my parents had left for me. Mrs. Chen became an unexpected ally when I confronted her with the truth. Her relief at finally being able to speak honestly was palpable, as she tearfully confirmed what I'd discovered. I knew your parents well, she said, holding my hands in hers. They were wonderful people, so excited about raising you. Your father was renovating the nursery when the accident happened. Your mother had just started reading bedtime stories to you every night. She led me to parts of the house I'd never explored, rooms Harrison had claimed were used for storage. My parents' bedroom preserved exactly as they'd left it, my father's home office with family photos covering every surface. My mother's art studio canvases half finished, waiting for an artist who would never return. In my mother's jewelry box, I found letters she'd written to me dated for future birthdays. For Sage's 16th birthday, read one envelope. Inside, a letter expressing hopes and dreams for the young woman I'd become, advice about high school and boys, and staying true to myself. Harrison had hidden these treasures for 15 years, denying me the connection to parents who'd loved me desperately. The gardener Thomas revealed that my father had been planning to expand the estate's gardens for my future wedding someday. He planted that oak tree when you were born, Thomas told me, pointing to a massive tree I'd climbed countless times as a child, never knowing its significance. Said it would be full grown by the time you had children of your own. Each revelation cut deeper than the last, but also strengthened my resolve. Harrison hadn't just stolen money. He'd stolen my connection to parents who'd loved me, planned for me, dreamed of watching me grow up. He'd replaced their memory with a lie that painted them as failures, while casting himself as my salvation. The business records Rebecca uncovered painted an even darker picture. Harrison had used my inheritance to fund risky investments that had failed spectacularly in the early 2010 seconds. To cover his losses, he'd taken out loans against properties that legally belonged to me. When those investments eventually recovered, he'd kept all profits while leaving me liable for the debts. He essentially used you as an unwitting business partner, Rebecca explained. Your inheritance funded his successes while any failures were structured to be your responsibility. If his investments had completely collapsed, you would have inherited nothing but debt while he maintained his personal assets. But perhaps the most insidious discovery was how Harrison had shaped my personality to serve his purposes. My desperate need to prove myself worthy, my fear of abandonment, my obsession with gratitude, all of it had been cultivated to ensure I'd never question his narrative or demand independence. He'd psychologically conditioned me to be the perfect victim grateful for abuse I didn't even recognize. As the scope of Harrison's crimes became clear, so did my path forward. This wasn't just about reclaiming stolen money. It was about exposing a fraud so comprehensive that it had robbed me of my entire identity. Harrison was dead, but his lies lived on, in legal documents, business structures, and the minds of everyone who'd believed his version of events. With the truth finally exposed, I faced a crucial decision: pursue quiet legal remedies to reclaim my inheritance or wage public war to expose Harrison's crimes and restore my parents' reputation. The calculating part of me favored discretion. Work with attorneys, restructure ownership, move forward without scandal. But the daughter who'd been denied the right to mourn her parents properly demanded something more. I chose war. My first target was Morrison's law firm, the prestigious partnership that had enabled Harrison's fraud for over a decade. Rather than accept their panicked offers of settlement and sealed agreements, I filed formal complaints with the State Bar Association detailing their role in the conspiracy. Within days, news leaked to legal industry publications about potential disciplinary action against one of the city's most respected firms. The media attention began slowly but built momentum as reporters discovered the human interest angle. Orphaned heiress discovers 15-year fraud by beloved uncle made for compelling headlines. I gave carefully crafted interviews sharing my story while building public sympathy and pressure for justice. I spent 15 years grateful to a man who stole everything from me, I told the investigative journalist from the Hartford Courant. He didn't just take money, he took my right to know my parents, to grieve them, to understand where I came from. He made me complicit in my own victimization by convincing me to be thankful for it. The business community, which had respected Harrison for decades, began questioning everything. Partnerships he'd built, deals he'd structured, charitable foundations he'd established. All came under scrutiny as people wondered what else had been built on lies. The Whitmore name, which Harrison had worked so hard to elevate, became associated with fraud and betrayal. But my most strategic move was targeting the character witnesses who testified against my parents in the 2008 custody proceedings. These business associates had sworn under oath that my parents were irresponsible and unstable, providing the legal foundation for Harrison's guardianship. Now, I had evidence they'd committed perjury, and I intended to use it. I started with Richard Caldwell Harrison's former business partner, who testified that my father was financially reckless and emotionally volatile. When I confronted him with documentation proving my parents' actual financial stability and success, his reaction was immediate terror. Harrison told us it was necessary, he stammered, during our recorded phone conversation. He said you needed protection from the trauma of their death, that pretending they'd abandoned you was therapeutic. One by one, I approached each perjurer with evidence of their lies and a choice: cooperate with my investigation and face minimal consequences, or maintain their false testimony and face criminal prosecution for perjury. The stampede toward cooperation was swift and devastating for Harrison's reputation. Their confessions painted a picture of systematic manipulation. Harrison had orchestrated the entire conspiracy, convincing respected business leaders that they were protecting a traumatized child rather than enabling theft. He'd provided them with scripts, coached their testimony, and leveraged their respect for him to secure their cooperation in fraud. The psychiatric evaluation that had been central to extending my guardianship proved to be Harrison's masterpiece of deception. Not only was the examining doctor fictitious, but the evaluation had allegedly occurred during a school field trip to Washington, D.C., where I had documented proof of attendance through photographs and permission slips my mother had saved. He thought of everything, Rebecca marveled, as we reviewed the evidence. Fake doctors, coached witnesses, forged documents. This wasn't impulse fraud, it was a comprehensive plan to steal your entire inheritance while making you grateful for the theft. The revelation that broke the story wide open came from an unexpected source, Harrison's personal banker, Margaret Walsh, who'd been haunted by suspicions for years. When news of the investigation reached her, she came forward with records showing Harrison had structured his finances specifically to hide the theft. I always wondered why a man of his wealth needed such complex trust structures, she admitted during her deposition. When I asked about Miss Whitmore's access to her own inheritance at 25, he told me she was not yet psychologically prepared for financial responsibility. It seemed odd given her obvious intelligence and education. Her records showed that Harrison had created a maze of shell companies and offshore accounts to launder my inheritance through his personal holdings. Money that legally belonged to me had been cycled through dozens of entities before being invested in properties and ventures that appeared to be Harrison's successes but were actually funded by my stolen fortune. The media feeding frenzy intensified as more details emerged. Local news stations ran features about the Mansion of Lies, where I'd grown up believing my uncle's version of events. National outlets picked up the story as an example of how financial fraud could destroy families across generations. True crime podcasters began investigating the case, interviewing anyone who'd known my family. But the revelation that truly captured public attention was the discovery of my parents' original plans for their wealth. Documents found in their safe deposit box, which Harrison had never mentioned existed, revealed their intention to establish a foundation supporting orphan children funded by their estate after providing for my future. They wanted to help kids who'd lost their parents just like I had, I told reporters, my voice breaking with emotion. Instead, the man who stole their legacy spent 15 years convincing me that caring for one orphan child made him a saint. The foundation they'd planned would have been worth hundreds of millions by now, helping thousands of children who'd experienced the kind of loss I'd suffered. Harrison hadn't just stolen from me. He'd stolen from every child who could have been helped by my parents' generosity. As evidence mounted and media attention intensified, the investigation expanded beyond financial fraud to examine every aspect of Harrison's life and business dealings. Other potential victims emerged. Business partners who'd been deceived, charitable organizations that had unknowingly accepted stolen funds, investors who'd been defrauded through schemes built on my inheritance. The scope of Harrison's crimes was staggering, but the emotional impact was even more devastating. I'd loved a man who'd systematically destroyed my connection to my parents while making me grateful for the privilege. Every birthday celebration, every achievement he'd praised, every moment of pride in our relationship had been built on lies that served his theft. But as the investigation progressed and justice slowly emerged, something unexpected happened: healing. For the first time in 15 years, I could grieve my parents properly, understanding that they'd loved me deeply and planned carefully for my future. Their death was still tragic, but their memory was no longer tainted by false stories of abandonment and failure. The legal consequences of Harrison's fraud unfolded like dominoes falling in precise sequence. Morrison's law firm faced disbarment proceedings for 3 senior partners, while the firm itself hemorrhaged clients and reputation. The character witnesses who'd committed perjury received varying sentences. Some cooperated fully and received probation, while others who maintained their lies faced significant fines and brief jail terms. But the most satisfying justice came through financial restitution. The court ordered the complete unwinding of Harrison's fraud, returning every stolen asset to my control and awarding punitive damages that essentially doubled my inheritance. Properties Harrison had bought with my money were retitled in my name. Investments he'd made with my funds transferred back to me, along with all profits they generated over 15 years. The mansion where I'd grown up believing lies became truly mine for the first time. But more importantly, I could finally transform it from a monument to deception into something that honored my parents' memory. I restored their bedroom, office, and art studio to serve as private spaces where I could connect with their spirits. The foundation they'd planned to establish became reality, funded by the fortune Harrison had tried to steal. The Whitmore Foundation for Orphaned Children opened 18 months after I discovered the truth, providing counseling, education, support, and financial assistance to kids who'd lost their parents. Our first grant went to improving the very foster care system I'd been spared from entering, creating programs to keep siblings together and ensure children understood their family histories. But perhaps the most meaningful victory was personal healing. I finally understood that my desperate need to prove myself worthy had been psychological manipulation, not genuine inadequacy. My parents had loved me unconditionally, planned for my future carefully, and died wanting nothing more than to watch me grow up happy and confident. Mrs. Chen helped me piece together memories I'd suppressed or reinterpreted through Harrison's lens. The abandonment I'd remembered wasn't my parents leaving me behind. It was the moment Harrison told me they were never coming back, then spent days convincing me that saying they'd left was easier than accepting their crash. Death. My 13-year-old mind, desperate to avoid more pain, had embraced his narrative. They read to you every night, Mrs. Chen reminded me as we looked through photo albums Harrison had hidden. Your father would do all the character voices, making you giggle until your mother said it was time for sleep. They were planning your 14th birthday party when the accident happened. A surprise trip to Paris because you'd been studying French. These recovered memories replaced the emptiness Harrison's lies had created. Instead of parents who'd abandoned me, I could finally grieve for parents who'd loved me desperately and been taken too soon. The guilt I'd carried about not being good enough to keep them dissolved, replaced by gratitude for the time we'd had together. The media attention eventually faded, but not before accomplishing something important. Other families came forward with similar stories of inheritance, fraud, and manipulation. The case prompted legislative changes, strengthening oversight of guardianship proceedings and requiring independent psychological evaluations in custody disputes involving significant assets. Rebecca Torres, the investigator who'd helped expose Harrison's crimes, became a close friend and eventually my business partner. Together, we established a consulting firm helping families investigate potential inheritance fraud using the expertise we'd gained from my case to protect others from similar victimization. Your story matters beyond personal justice, Rebecca told me, as we celebrated the Foundation's first anniversary. Every family we help, every child who keeps their inheritance, every truth we uncover, it's all connected to your courage in demanding answers when everyone expected you to stay grateful and quiet. The business Harrison had built with my stolen money continued thriving under my legitimate ownership, but I restructured its priorities completely. Instead of maximum profit, we focused on ethical development and community benefit. The first project under my leadership was affordable housing in the neighborhood where my parents had planned their own development before their death. Dating became possible for the first time in my adult life. Without the fear of abandonment that had haunted every relationship, I could finally trust someone to stay. I met David Chen, no relation to Mrs. Chen, despite the surname coincidence at a foundation fundraiser, and his genuine interest in our mission, rather than my wealth, felt like a revelation. You're the first person I've dated who knew my parents, I told him 6 months into our relationship. Not literally, obviously, but you know their real story. You understand where I actually came from. He'd read every news article about the case and understood that my foundation work was how I honored my parents' memory while healing from Harrison's betrayal. As I write this, 5 years have passed since I discovered the truth. The anger that initially fueled my quest for justice has mellowed into determination to prevent similar fraud from destroying other families. The foundation has helped over 3,000 orphaned children maintain connections to their heritage while securing their financial futures. Sometimes I wonder what my life would have looked like if my parents had lived, if Harrison's greed hadn't intersected with tragic timing. But I can't change the past. I can only ensure that their love, finally understood, guides the future I build in their memory. The oak tree my father planted when I was born is now massive, its branches reaching toward the sky with the same determination I've discovered within myself. Last month, I had a plaque installed beneath it, in memory of Samuel and Elena Whitmore, who loved completely and planned wisely for the daughter they couldn't stay to raise. Standing beneath that tree, I finally understand what justice really means. It's not just punishment for wrongdoing. It's the restoration of truth, the healing of wounds, and the transformation of stolen legacy into lasting good. Harrison may have taken 15 years of my life, but he couldn't take my parents' love or the strength they'd given me to eventually reclaim what was mine. And here's where I want to hear from you. Have you ever discovered that someone you trusted had been deceiving you about something fundamental? Maybe it wasn't inheritance fraud, but family secrets have a way of shaping our entire identity, don't they? Drop a comment and let me know if you've ever experienced that moment when everything you believed turned out to be a lie. And if this story of family karma coming full circle resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe for more stories about justice, healing, and the complicated truth about family loyalty. Share this with anyone who needs to remember that the truth, however painful, is always worth fighting for. Thank you for joining me on this journey from deception to justice, and I hope my parents' story reminds you that love persists even when the people we love can't stay to show it. May your own family truths bring healing rather than harm, and may you always have the courage to seek answers when something doesn't feel right. Until next time, remember that sometimes the greatest act of love is refusing to accept lies even when they're wrapped in kindness.